Not sure putting my daughter right before me was fair. Nope. Not for me, anyway. All right. Reset here for a second. My goodness. So the other day, I got a phone call, and it was a foreign number. Usually I don't answer those, but it was from somebody in Florida. We're planning a trip to Florida, so I thought, well, I better take it in case it's important, or there's some telemarketer whose time I can waste for a little bit. Anyway, it ended up being a person from actually a church down in Florida, and he was part of a team that had taken a trip to visit the United Methodist Mission in Keswa in Angola. And while he was there, he was kind of the designated scribe, and he was coming back to write an article about some of the things that they saw. And one of the things that they saw at the mission was the fish hatchery. And this is one of those things where they actually farm fish in the inland of eastern Angola, which is not anywhere near the sea. But they farm fish there, and then they teach other people in other villages how to farm fish as a form of a cash crop, basically, so that they can then sell them and then use it to send their younger people off to get more education than they can get just in the village. It's part of the plan. And he started telling me about this, and I figured, since I've been to Angola and I've shared stories about that before, that must be why he's asking me. And he's like, so can you tell me about the farm, the fish farm? I'm like, no. I wasn't there, you were. And he's like, oh, well, when we were there, one of the things that Ken, who's the missionary there, Ken Kome, he's our missionary there, said is that, told us, is like, well, isn't your church the one that paid for it? And I'm like, I don't know, was it? We do a lot of things, which I realized after probably sounded a little arrogant, right? We do so much good around here, I cannot be expected to remember everything that we've done. So it's a tough problem to have, right, Jim? So I'm kind of biding my time and moving through my WhatsApp messages with Ken and a couple of the other people in Angola. And sure enough, I found a text message from them from years ago saying, hey, here's some pictures of the fish farm, this, that, and the other thing. Hopefully our missions chair remembers this, that we did this. Lee, do you remember that we did this? Yeah, I vaguely remember too. Well, apparently they don't vaguely remember too. And so even all these many years later, when people come and they survey the fish farm and everything, they say, well, there's this church in Colorado. We think it's like Johnstown or Jamestown or something. We can't remember. But they're the ones that actually helped get this started. They gave us the money to get the whole thing going in the first place. And it was really fun to learn how it's continued to grow and build over the years and really become that thing that they wanted it to become, which is really this sustainable way of actually lifting people out of poverty that's more than just a handout. I mean, it quite literally is a ministry where we are teaching a man to fish. Well, women too, right? We're literally teaching people to fish. And I was struck by that moment because I think oftentimes when we are in the business of putting good out into the world, and that's really what service is, right? When we are called to service and the way we're called to serve, like talking about today, we are talking about our call to put good out into the world in all the many various ways that we can. So apparently a few years ago, we were in service to the people of Angola so they could be in service to each other. And while it may be a dim memory in my mind and several people's minds, because so much has happened since then, it is not, and continues to not be, a dim memory in their mind. And it continues, in fact, to be what it was intended to be, which is a transformational thing. So here we are today, getting to remember back to really what was a small, not small, but a single act of service that we engaged in a few years ago. And we get to now, and I got to hear, and now we all get to hear, how that has continued to grow and move and snowball, though I suppose snowball wouldn't be a good analogy for Africa, but we understand it. And it has continued to do what we want it to do. That is actually the beauty of service, and why it is, I believe, that God puts such an important calling on us to make sure that we are in service to each other. Because that service that we do for each other, for our neighbor, whether they be the neighbor sitting next to us or the neighbor across the world, we don't know where that's going to go or all the good that will come from it. In fact, we probably won't or ever know where it goes and all the good that will come for it. But when we are a part of it, especially if we're the ones that can first set it in motion, we get to be a continued part of that story no matter where it goes, even if we know it or we don't. Oftentimes we look around the world and we see a lot of things that are not the way that they are supposed to be, and some of those problems look really big. We don't always know what it is that we were supposed to do in response to those. Well, we have a saying around here that we put on the back wall of the church, just to remind ourselves that of the reality is like, yes, we can't do everything, but we can do something. And so we are called to ask ourselves, what is the something we can do? That is basically what Peter is asking people in this letter today. Now, the letter that we have today from Peter was written probably one of the later letters in the New Testament. It was probably written in Rome, and it was probably written to people in Rome, Christians in Rome, at a time where Christianity was starting to, one, get noticed. It flew under the radar for a long time, because Christianity was really a small group of people that were a subgroup of another small group of people, and people weren't paying a lot of attention. But as the decades went on, after Christ's death and resurrection, and as the movement continued to grow, people did start to take notice of this group of people who were behaving and acting and worshiping very differently than everybody else. And so by the time we get to the time this letter, 1 Peter, is being written to those Christians in Rome, people are starting to take notice of them as a group. And so there are starting to be people in positions of authority who are actually growing concerned about this group of people who is acting and behaving differently than everybody else. They seem to be gathering people together who are not all the same. They seem to be creating these spaces where literally both the rich and the poor are gathered around the same table, where people from different places and different backgrounds are coming together, and they're making this, and they're no longer participating in the same temple system that everybody else is, but instead are claiming that there is in fact only one God, and that is the God they are trying to worship together. And not only that, God sends somebody to live a life for us to imitate. And of course, we know the person that God sent, who lived a life that we are to imitate, is Jesus. So Peter is writing to this group of people where there's starting to be a little bit of anxiety in the system. The kind of persecutions that we think about in the early church and the really overt persecutions wouldn't come till later. Wouldn't come until several decades later. But at this point, it is starting, the seeds of it are starting to show themselves, and people are starting to get concerned. And so Peter has to write to them and tell them what it is that they're supposed to do. And he tells them throughout the letter something very interesting. He says the response of people getting nervous about you acting like Jesus is you are called to act even more like Jesus. And he spends most of the letter reminding them what that is and how it is that they are supposed to do it. Until we get to this point where we have these wonderful verses about service. And this fact that we are called to be in service to each other, called to be in service to our neighbors, called to be service to the world. But not only that, but he has a very specific way of talking about it and how it is that we are to do it. First off, he's saying it with some urgency. In Peter's mind, this idea of being in service and hospitable to one another, going out of our way to put good out into the world, is not something that we should take blithely. It's not something that should be, something that's on the back burner. And in fact, if you go one verse above where we started reading, you will read where Peter says, because basically the end is near. Peter isn't sure, as those early Christians aren't sure, when it is that Jesus is coming back, and they're fairly concerned it might be soon. And they really want to have their act together in case it's soon. Now, of course, we know that that's not how it would work out, but they did feel that urgency, and Peter felt that urgency. So there is some urgency behind these words. This idea of being in service to each other and hospitable to each other is not a nice to have. It's not something we do if we have time. There is an urgency behind it that says this is something that we are supposed to actually make a priority in our lives. In our day-to-day lives, we are to look for opportunities to put good out into the world. And lest we think we may not have everything we need to do the things that we want to do, Peter is also kind enough to tell us that we are supposed to do it with the gifts that we have. And we are supposed to do it with the energy that we have already been given by God. Which means he's telling us we might not always exactly have exactly what we want or the tools or the resources we want at our disposal to do the work in exactly the way that we want to do it. That doesn't mean we don't do it. We use what we have. We use the gifts that we have, we use the resources we have, we use the skills that we have, we use the compassion that we have to do all of the good we can do, even if it isn't all of the good that we want to do. He's basically saying, look around you, see what you got, and see what you can do with it. And do it with some urgency. Now, as I was thinking about this, I couldn't help but think back to what really for me is probably the most important and quite honestly in my life might be actually life-changing television experiences in my life, which of course came in 1985 when MacGyver went on the air. Now, hopefully we all remember MacGyver. I have no comment about the reboot other than don't bother. But the original Richard Dean Anderson, 1985 original, I actually very much remember, even though I wasn't very old at the time, I do actually remember the first time I watched the show and being captivated by it. And I don't know at the time I could tell you why I was captivated by it, but I can tell you Wednesday nights at 7 o'clock, that's when it was on, by the way. Was appointment viewing for me in my house. And I would sometimes even have to leave dinner early in order to make sure I got there right at the beginning, so if nothing else, I could hum along to the theme song, which I can still do, but I'm not gonna. Yeah, thank you. You're welcome. But it's only actually, though, in looking back, I can realize what it was that captivated me about the show. Now, if you don't remember or don't know, I'm sure I think it's streaming on Netflix for you. But MacGyver is the central character in the show, and he has this kind of, mission of the week kind of thing. It's much like a lot of the shows of the day, where there's either a person or a group of people, think like the A-Team or Mission Impossible or whatever it is, where they're given kind of a task. There's something going wrong in the world, and they got to go and save the day. And every week it's something different, and they have to go to some other far-flung places, and the amount of frequent flyer miles this guy must have had was amazing. The thing that differentiated and was different about MacGyver than all the other shows I'd seen before that is that MacGyver wasn't the kind of person when he got himself into a challenging situation who was going to punch his way out. Most of the other shows were that way. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with it. It makes for good entertainment, but it wasn't anything that young me could relate to because I was far from being, let's say, the toughest kid on the playground. No, not at all. Those were not my gifts. Those were not my graces. I've never been particularly athletic. It's never been me. So I could never really see myself in any of those folks. But here comes this character who comes along and instead, when he gets in a sticky situation or is up against something difficult, his tactic isn't necessarily to punch his way out, but to think it. And he's got a signature Swiss Army knife, and he uses literally whatever he can find around him, to the point for a while there, MacGyver actually became a verb, at least it was in my house. To MacGyver something, usually meant that it somehow involved duct tape because that was one of his favorite tools. But it was basically to do whatever you could do and make do with what you had around you to get it done. And I loved watching that every week. And it got clear to me later in the series is when they basically had done all the gimmicky things they could do, and he didn't really actually do all that MacGyvering anymore. I kind of lost interest in the show. But I do remember most of those early episodes and all the cool little things he came up with. And I was so excited the one episode where he used an electromagnet because I had just made one for my science fair. And I thought you could use it to make a doorbell, but you could also use it to defeat bad guys. And that was awesome. I love that show for that reason, because I think it teaches us actually an important lesson, that oftentimes what we need is around us. The thing that we need, the tools we need, the resources we need are around us. They may not be exactly what we want. They may not be exactly what we desire. But if we're willing to look at it creatively, if we're willing to put a thought and energy and effort into it, if we're willing to say, open our minds a little bit to let the Spirit move in us and inspire us in maybe a little bit of a way, I think oftentimes most of us will be really, really surprised by the amount of good we could do if we opened our hearts a little bit more and our minds a little bit more and allowed ourselves to be a little more creative about how that good can be done. The truth is, you can't do everything, which is great, because that's not the job. The job isn't to do everything. The job is to do what Peter told us his people to do, that God continues to tell us to do today, which is do the good you can, to the people you can in the ways that you can. Now, some of us have chosen the idea of being in service as our vocation, meaning some of us have decided to take the good we feel called to do and turn it in to the job that we do as well. And I think a lot about the number of people we have in our church here who are teachers or nurses or doctors or counselors or any of those things we typically call the helping professions. And yes, those professions are needed and they're important. And yes, it's nice that those professions come with a paycheck. But we all know that there are several professions in the world, and especially several professions in our country, where the level of the pay does not meet the level of the impact. And there are plenty that are the other way around, but that's a different sermon for a different day. But today we know that there are people in our lives who feel so called to serve, they decided to actually do it for a living and do it as much as they can so they can do it every day. The truth is, though, no matter what our profession is, no matter what it is we choose to do, whether we are working or retired or a student or whatever, we all actually have the ability to be in service to each other every day. I would argue that, quite frankly, while there are a group of professions we typically call the helping professions, any profession can be a helping profession if our hearts and minds are open to how God might want to use us in that role. Churches, too, are called, of course, to be in service. Peter is actually writing to the church. He's saying, this is what you are called to do. You are called to be in service to each other and called to be in service into the community around you. That's why you're there. Now, before I was here, as many of you know, I actually had a job where I wasn't in a local church, but I worked for the conference, and I basically got to go around and consult with all sorts of local churches, usually ones that were having some sorts of struggle, but other ones as well. And it got, really interesting to do that work, because when I came through and visit all these different communities to do these different trainings, I would always encounter a couple of different things. One is I would talk to them and kind of give them some thoughts and ideas, and afterwards, everybody would come up, several people come to me afterwards and say, it's not just the church that seems to be like this. There's this organization over here that I'm a part of that seems to be having the same struggle. There's my workplace seems to be having the same struggles. This other community group I'm involved with seems to be having the same struggles. It doesn't seem to be just the church. And I'm like, no, it's not going to be just the church, because anytime people get together, we tend to make the same mistakes. No matter what the reason that community is coming together, there are common pitfalls we all play in. And so the challenges that oftentimes the church faces in how to best be in service to each other and in the world are not unique to us. They are found everywhere. And there are some common threads that I discovered, some common pitfalls that is helpful to be aware of in this regard. And because I was an engineer before I was here, I thought the best way to do that was with some infographics. I know you're very excited. You're like, I'd hope there was some infographics this morning. One of the things that I began really quickly to talk to churches about, but not only churches, but other groups and organizations as well about, was basically trying to suss out the difference between how much time and energy and effort they were put into having meetings and how much time and energy and effort they were putting into doing ministry, basically, or whatever it is their purpose was. And I found, especially those places that were having the most challenges, there was a common thread of the proportion that they were spending in meetings versus ministry, which I think that's the first graphic for you. There you go. Oh, that yellow doesn't show up very good. All right. Well, yellow is meetings, and it kind of looks like a Pac-Man, as you can see. And that's intentional. This is, by the way, based on incredibly formal peer-reviewed. No, it's not. These are Jeremy estimates, so we'll treat them as such. But the one thing I noticed was fairly common is, and this can happen to places, is, we get really excited or we get really invested in having meetings, right? Getting together to talk about the thing that we're going to do. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. The problem is when you get so invested and interested in having the meetings that you fill up your calendar and don't actually leave yourself any time to do the things you're having the meetings about. Right? I have worked in several corporate workspaces who are incredibly guilty of this. So it is not a surprise that comes down sometimes and spills over to other places and can spill over to the church. And it can become, much like the Pac-Man we see on the screen, the requirement of the meetings that just gobbles up everything else and all the other time and energy. Now, I would argue, and I say this is based on my completely impartial impression of you all, because I am not in any way invested in this place. Not true. That this is one of those places where we actually do a pretty good job. And in fact, when I talk to our committee chairs and stuff, I think the next one, this shows my estimation. I think we're about like this. And I've actually had talks with some of our committee chairs where the most frustrating thing they have is, I can't get anybody to show up to meetings. And I'm like, I know. And the meetings are important. If you're supposed to be at a meeting, go. But because we keep our meetings limited here, and because we keep them to what we need to do, and keep them to being what the work that needs to actually get done, what that does is it means it actually leaves us more time and energy and effort into actually doing the ministry we are called to do. And when I talk to most of you out there, it seems very clear to me that most of you would much rather be out doing things and doing the ministry of the church than it is necessarily having meetings to talk about it. So I think we actually have a really good meeting to ministry ratio. And in fact, I will tell my clergy colleagues oftentimes about the fact that our administrative council, and if you don't know, the administrative council is kind of the overall administering board of the church. It's kind of the church council, kind of oversees all the affairs of the church. That our administrative council meets at 7:30 on Sunday mornings. And when I tell other clergy that, they look at me like I'm crazy. They're like, why would you do that? I'm like, no, it's brilliant. Because everybody's got to be there anyway, or they should be there for worship, so they're already there. Plus, most of us have jobs, so the meeting can only be this long before we all just start getting up and leaving. So it keeps it nice and efficient. We have plenty of time to get the work that we need to get done, but not so much time that we fall into the trap of making up more for us to meet about just for the sake of meeting. It also helps that we serve breakfast to each other. So if you ever want to come on the third Sunday at 7:30, you can find a nice breakfast and some nice people doing good work for you that you probably didn't even know was happening. And otherwise, we tend to do meetings after church and all that kind of stuff. And I think this is I think we have an amazingly good ratio when it comes to this. Yes, there is work that needs to be done. Yes, the finance team needs to meet, and the SBRC and the trustees, and that work is important, and it does get done. But the focus of it, the focus of the life of this place, the church does not exist so that we can have meetings and have them abundantly. The church, thanks, Chris. The church exists so that we can do the ministry and do the blessing we are called to do. So the next thing I always think about when I listen to the common complaints from other organizations, especially other congregations, is they often talk about their building and how much their building is used, or really how much of their building sits unused. And anytime I hear clergy complain about how much of their building sits unused, I think, don't tell my people that; they'll get really jealous. Because I don't know if you know, basically, I think the utilization rate at this church in particular is pretty high. And you know that basically anytime you try to find space for anything new, right? Jim's been there. And since I've been here, we've actually continued to grow the ministry that we do here, and we continue to push the boundaries of what goes on. And there is not really a square foot of space in this building that doesn't have a regular and routine purpose most of the time. And in fact, most of the space is used for several different purposes throughout the week. We've even found amazing and creative ways to use the lawn on the South 40, throughout the years, whether it's the Easter Carnival, or whether it's the car show, or the craft show, or I'm missing something. I'm forgetting. I don't even remember all of it because we do too much. But the thing about all those things too is those aren't just things for us here. In each and one of those things is also us being in service to the neighborhood and community around us. Our building is full and our building is well used, because we invest in using it well, because we invest in the ministry that happens here, because we want to put good out into the world. We want to be in service to our community. And we have this amazing resource around us, so why would we not use it? This is a gift, like Peter talked about, that we have been given by those who came before us, who helped literally lay the bricks, but also a gift that God helped us have by inspiring the hearts and minds of those who work so hard to bring it to us, and also it continues to inspire the group of people that continue to take care of it for us. We would be remiss to have such wonderful space and not use it. When Peter says, use the gifts you have, this is what it means. And the final measure that I think is oftentimes a challenge that I believe we do rather well is the idea is, how long does it take your church or your people or individuals, how long does it take you to act? How long does it take for something to go from this is a need that needs to be fulfilled to here is how we are going to figure out how to fill that need? I think because of the first one, where we're not overly obsessed with meetings, we are willing to act and have demonstrated over and over again our willingness to act, to be in service to each other and service in our neighbors much faster than maybe many others would. And does that mean sometimes it doesn't go exactly the way we want to? Sure. But does that mean that we did the wrong thing? No. Because remember, Peter is even talking to his people 2,000 years ago with some urgency behind it. When there is a need that needs to be met, when you have the opportunity to put good out in the world, when you have the opportunity to bless, we are called to not wait around and not to dilly-dally, but to look what we have, to look who we have, to get together and do what we can to be of service in the way that we can. I have watched our church do this more times than I can count, in big and small ways. I have heard so many times, only after the fact, that a need came up in some person's life and it was addressed by some group or individual within the life of this church before I even knew it was happening. We are called to be in service, and we are called to act, and we are called to do it with some urgency, because sometimes we don't have time to do anything else if we are going to do the work that God actually calls us to. I spent 5 years with you all, watching you all do this with amazing speed and poise and grace, before I myself found myself in need of your service. Many of you know, if not always, not all of you, that my family was changed dramatically last spring. Dang it. I have been wanting to talk a little bit about that for a while. And I figured this was the Sunday that it would make some sense. As much as I can, which I don't think is much. When I heard, so for you who don't know, last May we lost my wife, the wife of and mother of my kids, very unexpectedly. When I heard from people, I heard from your hearts. I got the text messages and the cards and the phone calls of care and concern. I received such an outpouring, and my kids did too, my whole family, of grace and support that I don't know you could possibly quantify. nor would I even try. Oftentimes, when I would hear, especially in those first few weeks, about things happening in the life of the church, I would only hear about things only into the point where someone would call and say, hey, we know this thing is coming up, and we just need you to know we already took care of it. I only heard about things because you all didn't want me to worry about it. Now, truthfully, I wasn't worrying about it all that much. But it was such a blessing to know. It was such a blessing to have confidence in the knowledge that even though I wasn't there to do the things that I am asked to do, that are my job to do, that you all would continue to love and serve one another, and that you all would love and serve me and my family, even though what was happening was completely unexpected and not anything anybody wanted to be doing. Nobody ran or hid from the work. Nobody said, that's too hard, I don't want to do it, as far as I know. But instead, people came together in the way that we know how to do, looked around and said, what do we have and how can we get this done? And figured out what could be done and how to get us from wherever we were to wherever we needed to go next. I've had the opportunity to speak to the leadership in the conference above me, and I said, God forbid anything like what I went through happen to anybody else, but if it does, the leadership of that church need to call the leadership of my church and ask them what to do. Because my church leadership could write a book on how to deal with these situations well. I've mentioned that a couple of times to some of the leadership here. And both times, they looked at me and they're like, I don't know what we would tell them to do. We just did what we did because it was the right thing to do. When we are practiced at serving each other in the way that God wants us to serve each other, when we are practiced at opening our hearts and minds to the leading of the Spirit, practiced at looking around and saying, what do I have and what can I do with it? When we strongly desire to put all of the good into the world we can in the way that God calls us to put good into the world, then it can and it does become second nature. It becomes that thing that is almost impossible to describe how it is that you do it because you just do. So as floored as I was by how amazing me and my family were treated and the gifts that we received, I was floored again so almost as much later when it was clear that folks didn't maybe even understand how amazing it was. I believe we have done a good job. Long before I got here, we have been blessed and we have inherited some amazing ways of being that puts service to God, service to neighbor, and service to ourselves at the center of what we do. I think it has become such a part of who we are that we don't often even recognize when we're doing it. It's become such a part of who we are, we just don't know how not to be hospitable in the way that Peter calls on us to be hospitable. I think that's an amazing and truly blessed thing. And I think we need to remind ourselves every once in a while how important that is. And how important it is both to the present and the future of this place that we continue to place service at the center of what it is that we do. We have unfortunately lost many of the people who lived their entire lives with servants' hearts. We've unfortunately lost many of the people who were the originators of who we are and how it is that we live. It now becomes each and every one of our jobs to continue to have that same heart, to continue to have that same desire, and continue to let the service and serving the way that God calls us to do it be at the center of what we do. Amen.